My father kicked me out for not getting into Harvard. 18 years later, I won a $2 million award funded by his company, and I donated every cent to prove I never needed his money. I'm 37 years old. I'm a professor at the University of Cambridge. I have a PhD in environmental chemistry. And 3 weeks ago, I lived through one of the most surreal moments of my life at a gala where I basically ran into the parents who kicked me out of their house 18 years ago. And when I say they kicked me out, I'm not exaggerating or being dramatic. They literally told me I had to leave because I wasn't meeting their expectations. But anyway, I guess I should start from the beginning, so this makes sense. Because the truth is, this whole story is like a shit roller coaster that ended in a way I never, ever would have imagined. I grew up in a family with money. I mean, a lot of money. My father owned Mosaic, a fertilizer company that basically dominated the market in the Northeast. And my mother was one of those women who organize charity galas and have lunch with other rich ladies talking about who knows what. And from a young age, I always knew there were very clear expectations about me, get the best grades, go to a prestigious university, marry, well, all that garbage. The problem is that when I got to high school, something in me just broke. I don't know how to explain it exactly, but it was like I was carrying a backpack full of rocks all the time. I had trouble getting up in the mornings, I didn't care about anything, and my grades started to plummet. Now I know it was depression, but at the time, my parents only saw that their perfect daughter was becoming a disappointment. My last 2 years of high school were a total disaster. I went from being an honor roll student to barely passing my classes, and every family dinner was basically an interrogation session, where my father would look at me with that disappointed face. I can still see perfectly if I close my eyes. My mother didn't even bother looking at me most of the time. She just sighed and moved the food around on her plate like my presence bored her. The only person in my family who seemed to care about how I was feeling was my Aunt Lydia, my mother's younger sister, who had always been like the black sheep of the family because she had married a school teacher instead of a lawyer or an executive. Lydia would call me every week to ask how I was doing, and sometimes she'd take me out for coffee just so I could vent. But even she couldn't fix the disaster that was my life at that moment. When it came time to apply to universities, my parents had a whole list of elite institutions where they expected me to be accepted. Harvard, Yale, Princeton, the usual ones. The problem is that with my shitty grades, none of those universities wanted me anywhere near them. I remember perfectly the day the rejection letters arrived, one after another after another. My father would open them at the dining room table and read them out loud with that tone of disappointment that made me feel like garbage. In the end, the only institution that accepted me was the local community college. And when my father saw that acceptance letter, he literally threw the envelope on the table and said it had been a waste of money to raise me. I was 19 years old when they kicked me out of the house. It was a Saturday morning. I remember I was in my room packing some things to move to an apartment near the community college. Nothing fancy, just a small studio. I was going to share with a girl I'd met at orientation. My father came into my room without knocking, watched me pack for a moment, and then said, "If you're going to waste your life going to that school, then you're not doing it under my roof or with my money." I told him I had already planned to move out anyway, that I was just going to finish packing, and he told me I had 1 hour to get all my stuff out of his house. 1 hour. My mother was downstairs having tea on the terrace like nothing was happening. She didn't even come up to say goodbye or see if I needed help. I called Aunt Lydia crying, and she arrived in her 2001 Honda Civic with her husband Mark, and the three of us put all my stuff in the car and in a U-Haul truck we rented. My parents didn't even come out to say goodbye. Aunt Lydia hugged me in the driveway while I cried like an idiot and told me I could stay with her as long as I needed. But I knew I couldn't do that because she and Mark barely had money for themselves. I ended up moving to that shared apartment, got a job at a 24-hour diner, and started classes at the community college feeling like my life had already ended before it really began. The first few months were brutal, I'm not going to lie. I worked night shifts at the diner, would arrive at the apartment smelling like grease and burnt coffee, sleep a few hours, and then go to classes where half the time I'd fall asleep at my desk. My roommate was cool but was almost never there because she had her own job and her own problems, so I basically lived alone in that depressing apartment with secondhand furniture and walls. So, thin. I could hear the neighbors arguing at 3 in the morning. But something weird happened in my first chemistry class. The professor, an older guy named Doctor, Collins, who had taught at better universities before retiring and teaching at the community college because he liked helping students like us, watched me during a lab experiment and observed me for a while. At the end of class, he asked me if I'd considered majoring in chemistry, and I honestly laughed because I couldn't imagine being good at anything. But Dr. Collins insisted. He told me I had a natural instinct for understanding chemical reactions, that the way I observed experiments showed a genuine curiosity he didn't see often. He offered me extra office hours if I wanted to learn more. At no additional cost, obviously, just because he thought I had potential. And honestly, I had nothing to lose. So I started going to his office hours twice a week after my shifts at the diner. It was the first time in years that anyone, besides Aunt Lydia, made me feel like maybe I wasn't a complete waste of space. My first chemistry exam was revealing in a way I didn't expect. I studied like I had never studied in high school, stayed up all night reviewing my notes and the practice problems Dr. Collins had given me, and when I got the exam back, it had a 92% in red at the top. 92%. I stared at that number for like 5 minutes, unable to believe it, and when I looked up, Dr. Collins was smiling from his desk. After class, he told me, "See, I told you had what it takes. You just needed to believe in yourself." I know it sounds super cheesy and like a movie, but in that moment I started crying right there in the empty classroom because it was the first time in years I felt like maybe I could do something right. Things started to change after that, slowly but changing nonetheless. My chemistry grades were consistently high, which gave me confidence to work harder in my other classes. I kept working at the same diner, kept living in that depressing apartment, but I no longer felt like I was just surviving. You know? I was starting to feel like maybe I was building something. Dr. Collins connected me with a professor at a nearby state university who was looking for research assistants for a project on water pollution, and although they didn't pay me much, it was real experience in a real lab doing real chemistry work. I spent my days going from the diner to classes to the research lab and back to the apartment, basically running on coffee and pure determination. I completed my associate degree in 2 years with a 3.8 gigapascals, and when I graduated, the only person from my family who attended was Aunt Lydia. She and Mark sat in the stands of that ceremony in the community college gym with a handmade sign that said, "Congratulations, Allison." And when I came down from the stage with my diploma, she hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. I asked her if she had invited my parents, and she just shook her head with that sad expression that meant yes, she had tried, but they had refused to come. It hurt. I'm not going to lie. But by that point, I was already starting to build my own life without them, and that felt more important than their approval. I managed to transfer to a 4-year state university with a partial scholarship based on my community college grades, and Dr. Collins wrote such an amazing recommendation letter that it basically guaranteed my acceptance. The next 2 years were a blur of advanced chemistry classes, more work at the diner because the scholarship didn't cover everything, and research projects that kept me in the lab until 2 in the morning. But I loved it. I genuinely loved every minute of being in that lab, mixing compounds and analyzing data and discovering new things. It was like I had finally found the place where I fit, where my brain worked the way it was supposed to work. I graduated with my bachelor's degree magna cum laude, and again, the only person from my family at the ceremony was Aunt Lydia. By that point, I had stopped expecting my parents to show up, but there was a small part of me that kept looking through the crowd hoping to see their faces. They never appeared. After the ceremony, I went with Aunt Lydia and Mark to dinner at an Applebee's because it was what we could afford. And she gave me an envelope with $500 that I know they couldn't afford to give me. I told her I couldn't accept it, but she insisted, told me she was prouder of me than she could express in words, and that my parents were idiots for not seeing the incredible person I had become. I cried in that Applebee's parking lot. Probably looked super dramatic, but I didn't care. What happened next was what really changed my life. Dr. Collins, who had continued being my mentor even after I left the community college, called me a few weeks after my graduation to tell me he had recommended my work to a colleague of his at Oxford, in England. I literally thought he was joking. He explained that there was an opportunity to do master's research in environmental chemistry, specifically studying remediation methods for contaminated soils, and that his colleague was looking for promising students from non-traditional backgrounds. I told him I didn't have money to study at Oxford, that I didn't even have money for a plane ticket, but he told me it was a fully funded program with a scholarship that covered everything: tuition, housing, food, everything. I didn't tell my parents I was moving to England. I only told Aunt Lydia, who cried and hugged me and helped me pack my few belongings. Mark drove me to the airport in that same Honda Civic they had used to get me out of my parents' house years before. And I remember sitting in the airport waiting area thinking that my whole life was in 2 suitcases and a backpack, but that for the first time in years I felt like I was going towards something good, instead of just running away from something bad. Oxford was, I don't know how to describe it without sounding pretentious, but it was transformative. The master's program was intense, surrounded by brilliant people from all over the world, and at first I felt like a total imposter. These were students who had gone to the best universities from the beginning, who spoke 3 languages, who had published papers before arriving. And there I was, the girl who had started at a community college working at a diner. But my research was solid, my work was meticulous, and I discovered I had a particular talent for identifying patterns in data that others overlooked. My master's thesis on bioremediation methods using specific bacteria to clean soils contaminated with heavy metals ended up being published in a respected academic journal, which basically never happens with master's work. My advisor at Oxford convinced me to stay for the PhD. He told me it would be a waste for me to leave the program, now that I was producing such high-quality research. And honestly, he didn't need to convince me much because the idea of returning to the United States and facing the reality of job hunting and maybe running into my parents terrified me. So I stayed. I spent the next 4 years completely immersed in my doctoral research, studying the effects of different types of fertilizers on soil chemistry and developing more sustainable methods for intensive agriculture. It was ironic, I guess, that I was researching fertilizers when my father had made his fortune in that industry. But I never thought much about it until much later. I finished my PhD when I was 29 years old, and by that point I had already published several papers and had presented my research at international conferences. They offered me a postdoctoral position at Cambridge, and then 2 years later, a tenured professor position. Professor at the University of Cambridge. Me. The girl who had been kicked out of her house for not being good enough. The girl who had started at a community college. Sometimes I would wake up in my Cambridge apartment and have to remind myself that this was real, that I had really built this life for myself. I kept in touch with Aunt Lydia all that time, of course. I called her every week, sent her pictures of England, invited her to visit me a couple of times, and paid for the plane tickets because by that point I was earning a decent salary. She kept me vaguely informed about my parents, not because I asked much, but because I think she felt she should. I learned that my father had expanded the business, that my mother continued organizing her social events, that they basically lived the same life they had always lived. They never asked about me, according to Aunt Lydia, never showed interest in knowing where I was or what I was doing. And honestly, after a while it stopped hurting. Or so I thought. The gala happened 3 weeks ago. It was an event for the Foundation for Sustainable Scientific Innovation, an organization that funded research in green chemistry and environmental technologies. I had been nominated for an award for my work on developing biodegradable fertilizers that reduce groundwater pollution, and although I didn't expect to win, they told me it was important to attend because several of my papers had caught the attention of potential sponsors. The event was at a fancy hotel in London, one of those with huge chandeliers and waiters walking around with trays of champagne. Definitely not my natural environment, but I had been to enough academic events to know how to behave. I arrived alone because I don't have a partner or anything. Just me in a black dress I had bought specifically for the occasion, and that honestly seemed too elegant to me, but Aunt Lydia had told me via FaceTime that I looked beautiful. I was in the main hall drinking a glass of sparkling water and talking with a colleague about a collaborative research project when I decided to go to the bathroom, and that's where it happened. I entered the women's bathroom, which was one of those ridiculously luxurious bathrooms with marble and lavender, soap and everything, and there was a woman standing in front of the mirror touching up her makeup. I didn't recognize her immediately because it had been like 15 years since the last time I had seen her, but when she turned around and our eyes met in the mirror, I knew exactly who she was. My mother. She froze with the lipstick halfway to her mouth, and I stood there in the bathroom entrance unable to move. For a moment, neither of us said anything. We just looked at each other in that mirror like we were strangers, which I guess we were at that point. Finally, she put the lipstick away in her purse, that ridiculously expensive purse that probably cost more than my first year of rent in the shared apartment, and said, "Allison, just my name, nothing else." I just nodded and said, "Mom," because I didn't know what else to say. She looked me up and down, studying my dress and my hair and probably calculating how much I had changed in 15 years, and then said, "I didn't know you'd be here." I told her I was nominated for an award, and she just made that sound she used to make, like a little sigh that meant she was processing information but not necessarily impressed. She asked me what I was doing with my life. Literally, with those words, as if a decade and a half hadn't passed. I told her briefly that I was a professor at Cambridge, that I taught environmental chemistry and researched sustainable agriculture methods. She nodded, still with that neutral expression I had never been able to read, and then said that my father was at the event too, that they were sponsors of the foundation through his company. My stomach tightened when she said that, because the idea of seeing my father after all these years terrified me in a way I didn't expect. But before I could say anything, she turned around and left the bathroom without saying goodbye or anything. I went back to the main hall feeling completely destabilized. I tried to look through the crowd to see if I could spot my father, but there were too many people, and the lights were kind of dim because they were about to start the awards ceremony. I sat at my assigned table next to my colleague and other researchers and tried to focus on the presentations and speeches, but my mind kept spinning about the encounter with my mother. Why were they here? Did they know I would be at this event? Did they even care? The presenter started announcing the awards. There were several different categories for different types of research. When he got to the Sustainable Agriculture Innovation category, I vaguely heard them announcing a special prize with a $2 million research grant. $2 million. It was an obscene amount of money, the kind of funding that could completely transform a research program. The presenter gave a long speech about the importance of developing agricultural practices that wouldn't harm the environment, about how the fertilizer industry needed to evolve to protect our water resources, all that rhetoric I myself had used in my papers and presentations. And then he said my name, Dr. Alison Wright from the University of Cambridge. For a second, I didn't process that they were calling me. I just sat there like an idiot until my colleague elbowed me and told me to get up. I walked toward the stage in a kind of fog, still trying to process that I had just won $2 million for my research. And as I was climbing the steps, I heard a loud noise of a chair scraping the floor. I turned instinctively and saw an older man getting up abruptly from his table and leaving the room through a side door. I only saw him from behind, but I recognized his posture, the way he walked with those long, determined steps. It was my father. I received the award on autopilot, shook hands, smiled for photos, gave a short acceptance speech that honestly I don't remember what I said. When I came down from the stage with the trophy in my hands, a woman from the foundation approached me to congratulate me and explain the details of the grant. She told me the money came from a special fund established specifically to support research in sustainable fertilizers, and that the main sponsor was a company called Mosaic. Mosaic. My father's company. I stood there feeling like someone had thrown a bucket of cold water on me. My award. My recognition. The $2 million. It all came from my father's money. I left the room needing fresh air, needing to process what I had just discovered. There was a terrace outside where some people were smoking and talking, and I stood there gripping the railing and trying to decide how I felt. Was I grateful? Angry? Confused? All of it at once, probably. I heard footsteps behind me and turned around expecting to see some event assistant, but it was him, my father. He looked older, obviously, grayer, more tired. But he still had that intimidating presence I remembered from childhood. He didn't say anything for a moment, just stood there a few meters away with his hands in the pockets of his expensive suit. Finally, I broke the silence and asked him if he knew I was going to be here. If he knew I was nominated. He nodded slowly and said yes, that he had seen my name on the list of nominees and had recognized my research area. I asked him why he left when they announced my name, and he was quiet for a long time before saying that he couldn't sit there watching them give me an award funded with his money after I had rejected everything he had tried to give me. I laughed. I literally laughed in his face, because the irony was too much. I told him that he hadn't given me anything except an hour to get out of his house, that everything I had achieved I had done completely on my own, without his help or his money or his approval. He stiffened like he always did when someone contradicted him and said that I had chosen to throw my life away at a community college instead of accepting the opportunities he had given me. I told him that he had kicked me out because I hadn't gotten into Harvard, that he had treated me like garbage because I was depressed and struggling and needed support instead of judgment. And he just shook his head and said, I had always been dramatic. that I had always made excuses for my mediocrity. Something in me broke when he said that. I told him I had a PhD from Oxford, that I was a professor at Cambridge, that I had published research that was changing how people thought about sustainable agriculture, and that if that was mediocrity to him, then I was happy to be a disappointment. I told him his money meant nothing to me, that I hadn't come here looking for his approval or his recognition, and that the fact that his company was funding my award didn't change anything I had accomplished. He looked at me with that cold expression he used to use, the one that made me feel small when I was a child. But this time, I didn't shrink. I just turned around and started walking back inside. And before I got to the door, I heard his voice behind me saying, "My name." I stopped but didn't turn around. He said he had followed my career, that he had read some of my papers, that technically my research was solid. It wasn't exactly a compliment, more like a grudging admission, but coming from him it was probably the closest he would get to saying he was impressed. I asked without turning around why he hadn't contacted me in all these years if he had been following my work. There was a long silence, and then he just said he didn't know how to do it, that too much time had passed. I told him he was right, that too much time had passed, and I went back into the event, leaving him standing there alone on the terrace. I didn't see either of my parents again for the rest of the night. I talked with other researchers, drank more champagne than I probably should have, and tried to process everything that had happened. When I finally got back to my hotel in London, around 1 in the morning, I sat on the bed, still wearing the dress, and called Aunt Lydia. I told her everything. About the encounter with my mother in the bathroom, seeing my father leave when they announced my award, discovering his company had funded the grant, the conversation on the terrace, everything. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she just said she was proud of me for not letting them ruin my moment, that I had worked too hard to allow my father to make this about him. I spent the next week thinking about what to do with the money. $2 million was enough to fund years of research, to hire research assistants, to expand my lab, for all the things I had dreamed of doing with adequate resources. But every time I thought about using it, I felt this weight in my stomach knowing it came from my father's company. I talked with my department at Cambridge, with colleagues, with Aunt Lydia again. Everyone told me to use the money, that I had earned it on my own merit, that the fact that it came from Mosaic didn't change that my research was the best in its field. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't take that money knowing that every time I signed a check or hired someone or bought lab equipment, I would be using my father's money. Not after everything that had happened, not after building my career completely independent of him. So 2 weeks ago, I announced I was donating the entire $2 million to establish a scholarship fund for low-income students who wanted to study science. Specifically for students like I had been. The ones who started at community colleges, the ones who worked full-time while studying, the ones who came from families that didn't support them or couldn't support them financially. The decision caused a small scandal in academic circles because people don't normally donate $2 million awards, but to me it made perfect sense. It was the only way to take something that came from my father and transform it into something that really mattered, something that would help people who needed it instead of just advancing my own career. Besides, my research is well-funded through other sources, and Cambridge supports me completely, so it wasn't like I desperately needed that money specifically. I haven't had any contact with my parents since the gala. Aunt Lydia told me my father called her house a few days ago asking about me, but she told him he would have to contact me directly if he wanted to talk to me. So far he hasn't called, and honestly I don't know if I want him to. Part of me, that small part that's still the 9-year-old girl who was kicked out of her house, wants him to call and apologize and admit he was wrong about me. But the adult part, the part that spent 18 years building a life without them, doesn't need that anymore to move forward. Last week, a freshman at Cambridge approached me, after class, to tell me he had seen the news about my donation. He told me he had started at a community college too, that he had worked at a coffee shop to pay for his classes, and that reading about my story had given him hope that he could also go far. I told him what Dr. Collins had told me so many years ago, that he had what it takes and just needed to believe in himself. It's cheesy, I know, but sometimes cheesy things are true. And that's enough for now, I guess.